Okay. Let's see what we've got here. Are you live? Let's see. How's it going, everybody? Wait for some people to come on in. Give this a little scoot. Okay. All right, who we got on Twitch? Give me a little what's up in the chat. Let me know how you're doing. Hey, hey, I see you. Hey, everybody. Great to hear it. Glad to hear you're doing well. Go Cowboys. Sure, why not? I'll get on board with that. We're just going to hang for a couple minutes. Everybody, great to see you. Thanks for tuning in for Capitalism Part 2. I'll try to monitor the chat a little bit, see what's going on over on Instagram as well. Yeah, man. Let me know if Let me know if it's up on the Insta too. The Instagram kept freezing on me. But let me know if it starts broadcasting over there, or maybe I'll close out of it and start again. I'm gonna try it again. All right, there we go. Yeah, I was having weird things with the iPad. All right, there we go. Hi, everybody. I'm gonna send some waves. All right. There we go. Let people kind of trickle in a little bit. Hey, hey. Hello. Great to see you all. I'm gonna hang for just like one more minute, and then we'll get going. Glad to have you all here. Happy Sunday, everybody. Last Sunday of 2020, right? There's not another one in there, is there? Last Sunday of 2020. Oh, there we go. There's my Brand Adams Grab your vape and chill for a few. Grab your vapes and chill for a few, everybody. Yeah, last Sunday of 2020, and then we'll just see what happens next, right? Um, but what else? I can't even think what else to say. Last Sunday of 2020. Nothing's going to change on when it turns to 2021, right? It's just going to be it's just an arbitrary demarcation. We're going to have to keep doing the exact same work that we've been doing the whole time. So, but that's good news. It just means the work doesn't change. We just keep doing more of it. We just get more dedicated and more informed and treat each other with more kindness and hold our own selves accountable as much as we can. All right, let's do Capitalism Part 2. So last week felt like a lot, and so it was just a ton to cover. And there's kind of, the way I see it, there's the historical thing that is capitalism, that is kind of a moral economic philosophy and has its roots in the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution. And then there's capitalism, sort of modern day American style capitalism, which is sort of what I view most of this stuff through, because that's just what I'm most experienced with, and because the way things developed in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, like American style capitalism became sort of, by and large, the default capitalism and the default market-based economy for the world. And now we have some new kind of stuff coming in, as like China and some other economies like segue into sort of an authoritarian capitalist sort of hybrid. But I think that that's for another time. What I'm really focused on is kind of the story of capitalism that we tell ourselves in America, and how it affects our politics and our markets, and then ultimately what that means for how we sort of function as beings on this planet, and stewards of the, is that a word? Stewards of the planet? Like in our role as like the dominant sort of consumptive species. We're the one species that sort of consumes out of balance with what it needs, because it's got like we throw our ecosystems off, and I just can't I can't stress enough that just informs everything that I've been looking at as we look at this stuff. Is the environmental impact of this stuff. And there's also there are these just deep racist, colonialist roots of capitalism as well, that just the more I get familiar with it, the more inescapable it seems, that it's all bound up together in a philosophy where it's so buried deep in the... Kevin Hardy, I am so glad to see you there. I don't know if you can stick around for a long time, but I feel like I'd love to hear how you're doing, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this stuff as well, if you throw them in the chat. So just a quick touch on the things that I thought were that really stuck out for me from last week, that I just wanted to make sure we all were roughly familiar with going forward, which was that the kind of Adam Smith Wealth of Nations ideas of capitalism that sort of came of age at the same time as the United States, and have gotten bound up in the United States in a kind of quasi-religious way, such that there is the original text of Wealth of Nations and the ideas that go with it, and a lot of those actually especially if you think of where that thing lived in a time period coming out of like Western monarchies and the birth of democracy and individualism, and the idea that an individual had agency over their labor, and that was the value that made up the wealth of a nation. And everybody, well, sort of capitalist apologists will then set aside, yes, of course, like there was slavery, and yes, there were like the stealing land from indigenous populations. But if we set all that aside, it's still a pretty good idea. If I'm just going to like kind of paraphrase without being glib to where we arrive at the idea that capitalism tried its best at the time, and we can't hold all that stuff against it. And I think it's deeper than that, and I think that it's more deeply implicated in that. And there's not time to go too much into that. But the one thing that I think is just a salient, tangible fact that we all have to agree on is, in the colonial model, like the North American, Caribbean colonial model, a lot of the initial investment in capitalism and in capital was stolen. And you just have to acknowledge that, because if you think about the capital from the beginning times and the way that capital grows, the way that capital expands itself, that's one of the key things about it, right, is that it invests and it gains value over time. If that stuff is stolen, then the whole system is suspect. And I just want to I will stick to that. I don't think there's really a counter argument to that, other than, oops, we didn't mean to, or we didn't know better at the time, or we didn't understand the way we understand now. I don't buy that. And the case for, even within our capitalist framework right now, I think the case for some kind of massive reparations is huge and inescapable. So yes, so I just want to, I just got to look at what, sorry, I'm going to be watching the chat as best I can. I'll try not to get too drawn up, but please keep throwing that stuff in there, because I'm so interested to hear what everybody has to say. So let's touch on one, go back to that Alexandra Hudson piece, from Capitalism magazine, which obviously we were looking at it last week, and it's a little bit, I think it's like, it's cherry picked, but I think it's pretty par for the course for how like libertarian conservative capitalists would characterize how we arrived at this moment. The economic history of the United States can be understood on the basis of a single fundamental principle. People were free, and they used their freedom to benefit themselves. Some people were free, okay. And then goes on to say, as will later be explained, all the essentials of socialism live on in the ecology movement, and are enjoying growing influence in the United States, even while socialism in the form of Marxism is in decline in most of the world. So, so that little piece is emblematic, I think, of a lot of the way that we structure our political, social conversations right now. It's capitalism versus Marxist socialism, and bundling up the environmental ecology, as he calls it, movement into that. Keep on interrupting, Kev. I'll do my best. But I love to hear all of it. So how that is really salient right now is that democratic socialists, for instance, are sort of painted as Marxist extremists, and they're painted as anti-capitalism, which they might be, but capitalism is tied up into this American spirit. and capitalists have really staked out their ground there and continue to be able to hold that political line in ways that I will just say are a little bit baffling to me. I'll just put that out there. I don't really understand it. Like, on a gut level, I get that the labor movement going back into the 20s and teens of the 20th century was associated with socialism, associated with communism, that the break between like in the Cold War, the break between American capitalism, Western style capitalism, and the sort of Soviet Union led communist experiment was these were mortal enemies, right? And I think that some of that sort of Red Scare, that red baiting, as they called it, right? The sort of communists or the atheists, and they hate America. It still manages to carry a little bit of weight now, possibly a lot of weight, and it all feels like it's bunched up together. And that's largely why I want to just keep bringing it up, because mostly everything that I'm concerned about gets to wealth inequality and the environment. And those are the two things that I just see as being untenable positions, even if you were to stipulate that capitalism is the most, like in the Ayn Rand kind of world of libertarian capitalism, is the only moral way to run things, which I'm not stipulating that, but if you were to stipulate that, it still would not be a tenable situation for the planet anymore. All right, so that's kind of where our little catch up and then bounce forward. So in the 20th century, what happens in the 20th century? You've got World War I, and an ascending United States. It's like one of the great powers, one of the greater powers, but it certainly doesn't have the kind of great power status that it has after World War II. In the country as a whole, there's a lot more fluidity as we're becoming more industrialized. Labor movements are growing. There's a lot of capitalist socialist clash. There are some bloody, nasty clashes. The police are implicated in being sort of amoral flunkies for the capitalists over and over and over again, which sort of, they're all tied up together. And I think that in some way that sort of hints at why conservatism, right-wing ideologies, and sort of proto-fascism fit more neatly into an American narrative than leftist, populist, anti-capitalist, or pro-socialist narratives do. I think that that's part of where that story really starts to take root. And then I think it gets hammered, like really hammered in during the Cold War. But you've got a boom time, you've got a bust, a Great Depression, and then you've got a bunch of different people trying to figure out what to do about the Great Depression. And during FDR's time, that was the big knock on him, was that this was socialism, this was big government stuff. And there's an economist named John Maynard Keynes, who will later, kind of Keynesian economics will be one sort of way to run one sort of ideology for a central bank, and Friedman style University of Chicago libertarian will be another idea. And we will kind of, those two things, those two ideologies, one being like the central bank, and feel free, anybody who, my economist friends, if I'm oversimplifying or if I'm missing major points, but for purpose of my narrative kind of here, I'm speaking broadly, but the Keynesian ideology would be that the role of the central bank is to stimulate and work with a market economy to print a lot of money when the times are rough, and then to pull back a little bit when the economy starts growing more on its own. And a more Friedman style thing is that the market really just wants to run on its own. And that is the ideology that in the 70s really starts to take hold, and that gets into that really is like, that's the Ronald Reagan, and then the trickle down Columbia Sooner. I said, I think you said kind of ironically, wait, so trickle down economics doesn't work? It doesn't seem to. It doesn't seem to really trickle anywhere, and it seems to do more to consolidate money and consolidate power, and to leave the middle and lower working classes in a real, we've gotten really used to a state of, living paycheck to paycheck is just taken for granted in a way that, like, in the 1960s, it was not. What was I just saw a statistic that if the minimum wage had kept up with the price of housing, I think it would be $24 an hour right now. And so the squeeze sort of is on the middle and poor working classes. So so this divide in the capitalist economic mindset bolsters up. So Friedman, where is my Friedman bit here, that I really wanted to just point out? So this is from The Hill, and it bears just diving into a couple of longer quotes on it. Marie von Rennenkampf in The Hill, the free market manifesto that broke America and led to Trumpism. On September 13th, 1970, the New York Times published the essay heard round the world. Milton Friedman argued that corporations have one and only one obligation: maximizing profits for shareholders. 5 decades after the Friedman Doctrine, the American middle class is in tatters. Millions of Americans are poor, sick, and angry, perfect prey for Donald Trump's resentful demagoguery and racial scapegoating. We won't go off into that. But this idea that corporations have one and only one obligation: maximizing profits for shareholders, that ostensibly falls under the umbrella of capitalism. But if we were to take that idea and set it beside Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, they would barely recognize each other, because that Friedman doctrine, that is capitalism devoid of any moral obligation. And I think that would be an idea that would have just seemed so strange to an Enlightenment intellectual thinker like Adam Smith. I think it was sort of taken for granted that the idea of functioning within a society was part of the point of being alive. And as capitalism progresses and it becomes increasingly, so this, if you take this initial idea, a person is just their labor, like the value of a nation is the aggregate labor of its citizens. And so on an individual level, you are free to do what you will with your labor, and that's, on the face of it, seems pretty good. But when you have a system that from the top level down, it is also divorced of morality, and everything is about maximizing profits, then I think you're stripping the individuals who make up the system of the ability to act morally. And they are also put into a system that is kind of like this iron law of wages deal, where everyone is living so desperately, like they are so in risk of losing food and housing and access to healthcare, that their own ability to make moral or free choices is really stripped down. And I would say that that's where we are right now, and that is one of the things that when we go back and just kind of pull back that idea of the initial investment in the country being a heist, being a stolen job, and you see how that capital aggregates over time until it finally like loosens itself from any moral obligation to the society, and then reaches this kind of libertarian capitalist apotheosis where it just goes like, everybody's on their own. I happen to have an enormous amount of hoarded wealth, so I'm going to do pretty good, but everybody should just do likewise. I got to peek real quick at what Kevin Hardy said here. Yes, the thing that happens is we basically wind up. So what Kevin says here in the chat is, I don't know if he ever hit on the trickle down, LA Woman. That was one later than him. I'm trying to blank on his name. Not Laffer. Kevin says in the chat, this is worth taking a step and just looking at. You can say what you will about the Friedman Doctrine. I think the issue is that government policy itself began to maximize profits for corporations, leaving the people, workers, largely unprotected. Yes. I agree. I think the Friedman Doctrine just gave it like politicians didn't have to run with that. Ronald Reagan didn't have to run with that. And neo-libs didn't have to run with that, but they did. What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is kind of it's as much as capitalism is the big soup that we swim in, the pot that we boil in is neoliberalism, I think. And it is a conflagration of conservative, libertarian ideas. I'm going to speak pretty broadly here again, and I think it's a more nuanced point than even I understand. I'm learning about it. I sort of myself go like, neoliberalism, yeah. But it is the beginning of the in a liberal Western style democracy. It is not the beginning. It's the underpinning of that corporatist government business structure that is kind of what Kevin Hardy is alluding to here, and which we've talked about before, where the government really begins to serve the corporations who prop the politicians up, and the people become largely disenfranchised and not looked after. And then we sort of run back to, like, when we're having our financial discussions, what do we do with taxes? How much should we be taxing? Who has money do we have money for roads? Do we have money for schools? Do we have money for the military? Do we have money for the police? one of the ideologies that people use and they sort of hold up as like, well, this is gospel truth, is the Friedman doctrine. So I think it's a pretty powerful and dangerous doctrine in the way that it is implemented. On its own, if everybody just sort of ignored it, or if it's sort of its moment came and went, I would say, well, it's an amoral piece of like, meh, I don't know. But because it became so powerful, because it is a tool and a rhetorical tool that winds up in the hands of powerful politicians and influences tax policy and public spending and austerity measures. It's incredibly dangerous, and it's a facet of this neoliberal idea of the corporations being the real engine that we need to watch out for. So Brant points out over here in the chat on Twitch, neoliberalism is what Bernie Sanders is pointing to when he talks about socialism for the rich. Right. So the idea that we prop up corporations because they are so important to the economy, it's as if we've sort of grabbed the socialism idea and married it with a free market idea, but we kind of got the worst of both sides of it. Or another quick way of saying it that I've heard often and I really like is that gains are privatized and losses are socialized. So when a big corporation is making money, when a big finance firm is making money, they keep that money. When they lose money in big ways, that gets either written off or bailed out, and there are ways that is then distributed among all of us, and we all take that loss. But that loss is shared by all, but the profits are not really shared by all. The profits are generally kept in pocket. That's how it looks to me. I mean, that idea of like, I think the first time I saw, I've seen it attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King, the idea of socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the rest. So that, if that's right, I mean, we're talking about 60 years that people have been kind of savvy to that progression of things. Also, as many people know, like what was the thing that was used to smear Dr. King the most? People called him a Marxist, right? That was one of the big smears, and that is one of the big things that has been used as like a way to demonize Black liberation movements. And I've been this is like, it's floated around in my head as history, and then as I've done a little bit of research for this thing and just read, I've been like, wow, it's like the same thing over and over again. It's the same rhetoric, it's the same tools, and it frequently seems like it's the same people acting out the same sort of, what would you call it? It's just like theater, but not like in a good way. It's just like these dumb shows where everybody does their own little thing. If you think of like the split between kind of this idea between like a more liberal Keynesian economic policy and a more conservative libertarian Friedman style policy, like even then the Democrats and the Republicans, they just kind of go through their same, it's like all the talking points are already pre-written, and they go back 50 years. Democrats tax too much. Cut taxes leads to growth. Like it's all of the elements of it are sort of pre-written out, and we don't spend enough time thinking about what's actually going on. And we don't think about what else is possible. Like we're trapped in this tiny little narrow band of imagining what the realities are for the system that we could live in. It's like we've got this version of capitalism over here and this version of capitalism over here, and anything else is just unimaginable. Like Brent said last week, I think you were giving a nod to Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism when you said, like, it's easier to imagine. Kevin, if you're still around, it was great of you to drop in. Great to see you. And thanks for the comments. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I kind of get that. It's the whole thing that we've been steeped in. But what do we have right now? We have late stage capitalism, or what is frequently referred to as late stage capitalism. And what is late stage capitalism? I mean, the amount of money hoarding, like wealth hoarding, that is going on right now it's useless money. It doesn't mean anything except power. It means private leverage over the government. And the government allows it to happen. Why would the government allow it to happen? Because capitalists, late stage amoral capitalists, right? Would it just follow that thread back to the idea that, like, you have no responsibility other than maximizing profits. If their only responsibility is to maximize profits, and they can get a good deal with politicians who can handle the laws, then you just kind of print money. And the power that the money gives to the politicians just keeps them where they want to be. And then that whole thing creates sort of the exact, like the opposite of what I think we imagine. And I don't just mean we, like maybe sort of lefty liberal people watching this show. I mean people who imagine themselves to be real, like capitalists, like real American, kind of that thing. I think when they think of capitalism, by and large, I think they're imagining that thing where I manufacture notebooks and I decide that I want to sell these notebooks for $10. And if people buy my notebook for $10, then great. And if they don't buy it for $10, then I can drop the price or I can go out of business. And that's, on some level, that sounds fair. And I think that that's what people imagine when they imagine capitalism. And when they imagine socialism, they imagine like authoritarian communism circa 1960, where the government tells you everything that you can do and what everything is going to cost. And those are sort of the two things that they imagine. They don't realize that they're not living in the capitalist idea that they think they are. And they imagine that the alternative is total loss of freedom. They associate, yes, jinx, Elizabeth Weil Greenberg, they associate capitalism with freedom. And I think that makes, like, I get why those two things can be conflated. But if we interrogate the idea of what capitalism is right now and what it's doing right now, I would submit that capitalism is leaving the majority of us in the United States not particularly free. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, when you have no equity built up in a house, when you have no guarantee of health care, when let's talk about environmental racism for a second, right? When corporations can decide what areas are more polluted, and the polluted areas are almost without fail poorer and black and brown communities, how free are you? Even if we set aside all that other stuff about capitalism being based on stolen goods, even if you just look at the moment right now, how free is that? I say not that much, right? So the great trick then, the great trick is that the capitalists, which really what we're imagining, what we're dreaming of when we think of capitalism, what we're thinking about is like individual markets. We're thinking about people being free to choose where they work and negotiate for a price and so forth. What capitalists do is they try to get more capital. They drive down wages. If your only obligation is to maximize profits, like it said in the document, well, then you would be negligent if you took steps to protect the environment, if you paid your workers more than the absolute, like you need to drive down wages, you need to maximize profits that way. And now you might say, well, what if nobody will work for that? Well, that's the anti-union. That's the actively anti-union, actively anti-collective bargaining scam that is going on. And the government is hugely helpful in that, right? Because they run all the laws. So that's the capitalism that I'm thinking of right now. And that's the capitalism that I think deserves deep, deep, deep interrogation. What happens next? I don't know exactly. I think that democratic socialism is a nice transition, but really what I want to do is just activate the part of our brain that says, what is the system that we're in right now? Because I think if we could get enough people to just step back and go, wait, this is crazy. Like, this thing is crazy right now. People have said it before, and I'll just chime in on it. This pandemic thing, in a country as rich as this, should have not been like this. And this idea that everybody's just kind of on their own is so counterproductive. I mean, even set aside how kind of evil I think it is, it's also just not very efficient. It's not a good way to run a business. You know, if this country is your business, this is not a good way to run your business. This kind of crazy libertarian, everybody's all in it for themselves. And libertarian and capitalist kind of, they go together. They have got a lot of shared stuff. I think that there's a bunch about libertarians that, like, libertarian socialists could really do well with. At the end of the day, I'm fighting, you know, I want people to be free. I want people to be as free as possible. I think that when you're crushed in a financial, social, political system where oligarchical power brokers and politicians are all kind of pulling all the levers together, I just don't think you can be that free. I think it's an illusion of freedom. It's this illusory freedom of the kind of every person for themselves kind of thing. I don't think that that's a real freedom. I think that a real freedom comes in watching out for each other, in a kind of a mutual aid mentality. And I think that that is ultimately where we have to go. And again, just to kind of double back to this thing that I said at the beginning, I think whether you want capitalism or not, I think we're not going to get to keep it that much longer, because I think it's destroying the planet. I don't think it's going to work. If your only matrix for how you succeed and thrive and live and run your governments and run your societies is growth, consumption, never mind whether it's like morally okay or not, never mind whether it's ethically okay or not, never mind whether maybe it's none of my business if you want to just consume everything and tear down whatever is on your property. Like, never mind whether that's okay or not okay. It's just not going to be a system that lasts much longer. There's too many people consuming too much, and we're not going to make it. Like, as a species, we're just not going to make it. We have a human-created, capitalist, human behavior-created climate catastrophe not on the horizon. We're in it. It's happening now. And we're going to have to find ways to mutually watch out for each other. And this capitalist individualist ideology is going to have to evolve. I don't know what happens next, but we have to open up to it evolving. And I believe we have got to stop framing things in terms of, in America, it's either capitalism or you hate America. Your two options are capitalist and traitor. Like, that's just not going to work anymore. And I do say glibly. But it literally sucks up oxygen from the conversation. We just don't have time to continue having those conversations. We've moved on from that. We must move on from that. I love this thing. I just randomly found this floating around. Markets are not, in my opinion, a problem. Capitalism, however, is. I am not interested in taking away your right to sell the fruits of your labor. I'm interested in securing your right to control your labor. And I'm interested in securing your right to the wealth that your labor generates. Socialism doesn't mean the government takes your money and gives it to people who didn't earn it. It means that working people have democratic control over their workplaces. It means people get what they earn, not what somebody else decides they should get, regardless of how hard they work. That's just an idea we're going to have to hold in our heads, and we're also going to have to open up to, I think, radical new ways of existing in the world, like with respect to the resources and the air and water and the animals. To paraphrase the saying, like, if you don't find humility, humility will find you. It's going to happen one way or another. We can be proactive and try to get as ahead of it as we can, even though this is a thing that probably, if research hadn't been stymied by, Exxon and Mobil, and we would be a little bit farther ahead of it. But we're in the world that we're in, not the world that maybe we wish that we had been in. But don't fall for that being realistic stuff. When people say, oh, that's just not realistic, that's not human nature, I just don't fall for it, and try to encourage other people not to fall for it, because that is just a distraction. That is a distraction. Poor human nature, Emma Goldman said. What horrible crimes have been committed in thy name? Every fool, from king to policeman, from the flat-headed parson to the visionless dabbler in science, presumes to speak authoritatively of human nature. The greater the mental charlatan, the more definite his insistence on the wickedness and weakness of human nature. We're capable of all kinds of stuff. And I think that this is just one tiny little facet of it, but within this capitalist sort of penury, to use a word, we're convinced that without this framework, people just chaos and starvation. But that's kind of the gun that they hold to your head. They say, it's this or you're fucked. You better listen to this, because otherwise we'll all just be running around starving to death and stabbing each other. And I just don't think that that's true. I think that we just allow ourselves to be told that story enough. And then the muscles that help us to work with each other and watch out for each other and not take so much more than we need. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for people doing well. This is not, I'm not talking about, I'm all for it. I think it's good, a little bit. But it doesn't need to be that much. And when you buy into the idea, you can see the sort of the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks of the world, you can see that it means nothing. I think you can read it on their faces. You can see that it means nothing to them, that they have this incomprehensible wealth while people are starving. All they can think of is, yeah, but it's mine. And if you take it away from me, then I'm getting weaker. You're taking my power away from me. And I do understand that on some level. I think it's insane, but I understand it. But I think it's a kind of a mental illness that is the product of being told all around you and from the time from the time you were born, that the only measure of your worth is your wealth. It's not how well your community is taken care of. It's not how well the people who can't help you, how well you do for them. It's just what can I accumulate? How much stuff? And you can't police what I do with my stuff, because it's my stuff. And I will consume whatever I want. And I will do whatever I want to this land that I purchased, because it's mine. It's mine, 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 mine. And no one can tell me what to do, because if you tell me what to do, if you suggest that I can't do that, if you ask that I pull back a little bit, well, then the next stop is tyranny. You're taking my freedom. And I think that is just, it's a profoundly, if it weren't so dangerous, I could just sort of pity it and say and say it's sad. Because it is, it's sad. But it's also incredibly dangerous. And we have to keep hammering away at this thing. And I'm going to wrap up by saying I don't know exactly what to do, except we need to keep on hammering away at it. And it's getting at the foundations of it over and over again, and just saying that's why that? Why are we defending that? Why are we defending that? Why do we need that? And I find a lot of hope from the kind of the rising left wing of the democratic socialists. I find a lot of hope, because actually what I find the most, what gives me the most hope about them, it's not so much it's not the organization, the democratic socialists, but it's the idea that there is just a recurrent questioning. Why are we doing this? Why do we need Why do we need the police? Why do we need this much police? Why do we need Amazon? Why do we need this stuff? Why don't these people have health care? Why? I think we've allowed ourselves to just accept it as realistic. That's the capitalist realist thing. It's the thing where it goes, well, if you're gonna be a grown-up, if you're gonna be mature, this is the way the world is. That's the tacit and explicit way that I think we're educated. I feel like I was kind of talked to that way. It was like, you might like all these nice socialist ideas, but grown-ups need this. Grown-ups need standing armies, and grown-ups need police, and grown-ups need to learn that some people are just poor and some people are not. And it's better to not be poor. And that's it. And that's sold to me as that's just what's real. And it's immature to not believe that. It's unrealistic. But even that reality is constantly changing. It's this very fungible. Mark Fisher says this in Capitalist Realism. Capitalist realism, however, entails subordinating oneself to a reality that is infinitely plastic, capable of reconfiguring itself at any moment. And that's the thing that I think that ties up kind of everything that I've been saying, which is that we're sold this mirage of reality, and it would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous, and if it weren't costing so many human lives in the moment and doing so much long-term damage to the planet. And that's the thing that I just think interrogate. But get at the social, I mean, come at the other wing too, because I think that nothing should be taken for granted. Everything should be a question. But the question of is late-stage capitalism going to work? I think the answer is a resounding no. And that's just the reality of it. And I think that the planet is going to decide that, even if we can't get ourselves together. And I think that we should work hard to try and get ourselves together. Oh man, y'all, that was a lot, but I really appreciate you. I appreciate you tuning in, and everything about all of you. I'm going to sign off for the night. That is the last Empathy Anarchy for 2020. As always, our show is produced by Brant Adams. Research help from Elizabeth Weil Greenberg. Show's music was composed by Charles Ellsworth. Big thanks to the Aquarian for making this happen. Marissa Armstrong out in California. Love you so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Until 2021, I encourage you all, keep your heads up, keep your hearts open. Don't let anything surprise you.